everybody. It's great to see all of you here. Happy Pride Day. It's exciting to be in San Francisco on this day, so close to the festivities, even though we can't see them here within this in this windowless room. Really happy and excited to be here with you all, and I've been very happy to have played a small role in the making of the Latino Americans documentary that you all know that aired on PBS, and to have been able to be involved with the Park Service in trying to bring Latino history into the Park Service. I think that the Latino American series that you all know is in many ways really a terrific encapsulation, a short one, of the rich and complicated histories of Latinas and Latinos in the U.S. across several generations, and was thrilled to see the grants that came forward from all of you and others from around the country. I'm excited to be helping with a couple of those grants in the coming months, and I was asked to talk today here to you all about key humanities themes in the Latino American series. Now, I'll admit I wasn't quite sure what that meant when the request came my way, and I soon came to realize it's a tough task to talk about humanities themes because, after all, there's so many ways to characterize the humanities. So what are the humanities? If you look carefully at the series, though, I think you'll see hints of dozens and dozens of concerns and approaches and ideas that connect with various fields of the humanities. You can see the influences of art historians, of literature scholars, of linguists, of historians, and humanists of other sorts. And I think it's a real strength of these films that the humanities so imbue the content that you see on screen. And it seems, I think, a little silly to say, but I think it's worth being clear that the types of questions and research approaches that one encounters in the humanities can provide a lot of insights about Latinos in the United States, right? A very obvious point. And in making this point, I mean no disrespect to other fields. I have the greatest respect for the sciences, for math, and as they say, many of my best friends are social scientists. But for me, at least, the humanities embodies a set of promises, a set of approaches that shouldn't be lost in our admiration for other fields. There's a rich body of humanities scholarship about Latinas and Latinos, and the librarians in the room, of course, know some of that material very well. Scholars working on Latino studies, Latina studies, have been leaders for several decades in American history, in English departments, in professional associations that promote interdisciplinary scholarship and elsewhere. But despite the hard work of so many people in these fields over time, the researchers and the writers, despite their leadership in the academy, humanities insights about Latinos have often not received the attention that they deserve. The impact of the humanities in public discussions about Latinos, I think, has actually been quite muted too often. When we read news stories about Latino families, or when we see television reports about Latino immigrants, or we hear about the high incarceration rates in these communities, or we debate the aspirations of Latino youth, we tend, I think, to hear from, if we hear from academics at all, we tend to hear from sociologists, from legal scholars, from anthropologists, and from political scientists. These are, of course, the social scientists, and they've been quite successful, at least some of the time, in framing public policy debates and in answering questions posed by our nation's punditocracy. Now, the place of social scientists in these debates, of course, is not new. Observers joked in past decades sometimes that Mexican American and Puerto Rican households, say in the 1930s or in the 1950s, often consisted of two parents, a couple of children, and at least one sociologist. The social scientists have long been close at hand. Now, one of the things I like most about Latino Americans, the series, is that it looks beyond social science frameworks to discuss the history of North America and the Caribbean. You can find important social science perspectives in the series, of course, but I think for me at least, this is a humanities project through and through. You all will be developing efforts in your respective communities with NEH and ALA support that will follow the film's examples. And so what I wanted to do today, in the hope that I could say something that might be of broad use to many people coming from many different places with many different approaches and levels of background, is to offer some thoughts about 5 features or 5 hallmarks of the series that resonate broadly with the interests of the humanities fields, and that may be then of some use to many of you as you think about your own local efforts. First is what I will call, for shorthand, voice, the importance of voice. This is, of all of these, probably most important to me, and it's something that David Montejano already referenced in his remarks. As I see voice as key to humanities fields, and one of the key features that interests me the most. Now, by voice, I mean that the series amplifies, it makes louder, the words and the opinions of Latinos themselves, right? The series uses the observations and the experiences of people who have not received much historical attention to rethink American history. It theorizes, I think, from their perspectives, rather than imposing more abstract concepts about them or about society or about culture onto their experience. The films are, to a considerable extent, a collection of voices. The filmmakers allow historical subjects to speak for themselves, and they force those who watch the series to listen, to hear directly from people who might otherwise and have otherwise often been ignored. By voice, I also mean that these filmmakers also allowed experts who know something about Latino histories to speak. The series is quite good, I think, in amplifying not only historical voices that characterize, say, 19th century California, or turn of the 20th century Florida, or mid-20th century New York City, but also the scholars who've spent decades working on these topics and trying to make historical sense of Latino experiences. In reading about the grants that have been made to support your projects in Latino history that make use of the Latino American series, I'm most excited by the ways in which many of you intend to take this opportunity, again, as Professor Montejano said, to hear new voices in your communities, or to allow the voices of the past to speak more loudly to local students and others. Now, people often joke, as you all know very well, that librarians are the people in our neighborhood who say shh, right? Who try to keep things quiet in their buildings to tamp down the talking. And I already know this is a gross mischaracterization of so many of you and what you do. And I think it's clear that these grants and what you'll be doing with them will make it clear to others that this is a real mischaracterization, that in fact you play important roles in your locales in collecting stories, not silencing stories, in hearing from your communities, in drawing out those who have been quieted in the past. And so in the spirit of this documentary series, I would urge you, as you undertake your work, to think about how you will encourage members of your communities to give voice to their experiences in the coming months and years. How will you make them feel comfortable to speak? How will you dignify them as interpreters of their own experiences so that they are comfortable speaking? How will you keep their stories safe once you have them? And how will you share their voices with others? For those of you who plan to provide a podium also to writers and scholars who are experts in Latino communities, how will you assure a diversity of opinions? It's one of my favorite Tumblr blogs some of you may have seen. So how will you assure that many different and disparate voices are there at the table? What might you do to start and sustain a conversation between these experts and others in your city or in town? In what ways will you celebrate the expertise of the people you bring in? But is there also a risk that in celebrating the expertise of people like us, you may make us seem to be beyond critique to others in your audiences, sort of untouchable figures who come down from Mount Olympus and speak truth to mere mortals. You don't want to do that, of course. It would be a gross mischaracterization, at least of me. I don't know others. So that's voice. Now, the second humanities theme that I'll highlight as a key to the Latino American series is time. Many scholars in the humanities have long been obsessed with time, with chronologies, with change, with patterns in history, and more. And this sort of concern about time distinguishes us from many scientists and social scientists who are, I think, more quick to look for transhistorical, static models that explain human behavior. You've all seen the documentary, or at least part of it, so you know that Latino Americans takes a chronological approach to describing the histories of Latinos in this country. It's a destabilizing way to talk, I think, about who we are, a destabilizing way. When we remember the passage of time, we have a more difficult job of speaking in absolutes about who we are as people. You, of course, are a different person today than you were 20 years ago, just as Mexican Americans are different today than they were in the 19th century. So a public programming focus on change over time can be very valuable today in discussions about contemporary identity, whether individual or communal. The documentary series helps to make clear that identities are always in motion. And I myself have used these films in some of my own teaching to try to help students understand better that their assumptions, their contemporary assumptions, their concerns, and their conclusions are in fact framed by this historical moment, the one that we are living in ways not unlike those captured in the PBS segments about other historical moments. So you might find yourself doing something similar with different audiences in your own locales. In thinking about how populations have changed over time, about how political concerns in this country have changed, or about how specific places have changed, we might get more comfortable, at least I think we have a chance at getting more comfortable, with the types of changes that we're recognizing in our own lives and debating on the front pages of our newspapers. We might also develop insights or tools that will help us grapple with all sorts of changes that are affecting many communities around the country. For one thing, keeping our eye on time, keeping our eyes on the clock, so to speak, can remind audiences to ask questions that get beyond static identities, right? Like, what is an American, or who are Latinos, which I think are really dead-end questions most of the time. To focus instead on causes and effects of changes. If we think about change over time, we end up asking questions about why this started and when. When we ask questions about when certain things happened, we often find it impossible not to follow up with a question about why. We might take an example here just from this past week's news cycle. There was a lot of stuff in the news this week. For example, Confederate flags, we all know, are flying over state houses in certain regions of the South. That's a what? That's something that we can recognize in our own day. If we ask questions about time, we might come to a question like, when did state governments start to decide to raise those flags over the state houses? And we would come to see that this happens when? In the 1950s and the 1960s, right? This is not a direct and unbroken legacy from 1865, but in fact is a much more modern development. And then we might ask, why then? Why in the 1950s and 1960s? And be able to share with our audiences that the decision to fly these flags then was, of course, a response to civil rights protesters in the post-World War II period. And so now with this, moving from the what to the when to the why, thinking about time, we have a different way to discuss what the Confederate flag means today, why it's there, and where it comes from. Now for me, the Latino American series can do similar types of work. It does not create at least the way I see it, a set of monolithic portraits about who Latinos are as a people. It does not list the kind of timeless qualities of a Puerto Rican or get to the essence of what it really means to be Mexican American in this country today and yesterday. The movies show instead that these groups have changed over time. They suggest that there really may not be an essence to what it means to be Puerto Rican. And they show that why the country changed and how the country's changes produced different kinds of Latino experiences and different kinds of Latino perspectives. So as you all do your work with Latino public history and use these films as jumping off points, I would urge you to think about how you can help your communities think more clearly about change over time as part of the work that you do. So, voice and time. The third humanities theme that I want to highlight for you all is the importance of something I've already mentioned, place. The importance of place, the importance of geography, the importance of location. We, of course, all ourselves come from someplace, and we are someplace now. And we all know that location matters, right? It was recently graduation season in our nation's high schools and colleges, and one of the best-selling Hallmark cards that I'm sure you all have seen quotes from Dr. Seuss, "Oh, the places you'll go." I'm sure you've seen it. Maybe some of you have given it as a gift. But I think it's very clear that when we aren't careful, we end up eliding the importance of place when we talk about history. We end up eliding how critical place can be in shaping our experiences. We make generalizations that cross not only time, things have always been this way or for a whole long time, but also space. We end up lumping together as if geography doesn't matter. Some of this is probably unavoidable and maybe not a bad thing at all, but when we, as local practitioners, work to be more specific about spatial differences, regional varieties, and the differences that location can make, we have the opportunity to develop huge insights about specific experiences and entirely new ways of thinking about what we generalize about when we lump. Latino history scholars, for example, have spent a lot of time on local community studies over the years that do just this, that test how big patterns played out in specific neighborhoods or specific towns or specific cities. Puerto Ricans on the East Coast in the early 20th century were moving, we know, into cities and experiencing racial segregation in the US mainland. But, scholars have asked, what was their experience similar or different in a place like Philadelphia and New York City, right? What's the regional variety? What's the local? What does the local have to do with it? And how did the experiences of the large numbers of Puerto Ricans who moved to Hawaii in the first years of the 20th century compare to the experiences of those back east? What role does place play in these experiences? Scholars and filmmakers have also shown how important other local dynamics are for shaping Latino experiences and perspectives. We now have a much better sense of how one major employer or industry can shape an entire community. Think, for example, about the Ford Motor Company in Detroit and how Ford shaped the Detroit experiences in ways very different from the experiences in South Chicago or Cleveland or many other northern Midwestern cities. How people understood the city of Detroit, what they aspired to in the city of Detroit, what they wanted for their kids, and how they saw one another. We also know how important a single local institution can be, a local institution, for shaping the experiences of Latinos and others. Think, for example, of the power of some churches that you know in your areas, in your neighborhoods. How churches have shaped family life across generations or entire neighborhoods. The influence of an influential pastor or priest or the common experience of attending a local Catholic school and what that school did for better or worse with its kids. And although it may be less clear in the age of the internet, we know also that immigrants retained relationships with their homelands, their home communities far away, to their hometowns and to their native languages. And that the ways in which they retained connections to other places had a lot to do with the place where they were. Professor Montejano's referenced the movement of large numbers of Tejanos, like his grandfather from South Texas north. That's one example of the kind of spatial relationships that develop over time. Space and place matter in these ways. Cubans living in a place like Key West, Florida, a short boat ride away from Cuba, moved back home to Cuba more easily, of course, than those who lived in New York City. Place mattered in distinguishing those experiences. Those communities probably had a different understanding of where their home was because of the proximity of Cuba to their Key West neighborhoods. Similarly, Spanish speakers who lived in large urban communities with other Spanish speakers in barrios, with a lot of other Spanish speakers, with Spanish language movie theaters, with radio shows, with newspapers in Spanish, they forged a different sense of Latino ethnicity because of where they were than those who lived in smaller and more isolated places. So your work can show, I think, what's special and different about your locales in some of these ways. And I think you can use the film to make comparisons and contrasts with what you're seeing in your specific places. A focus on the importance of place in Latino history highlights not only the variability and the diversity in Latino experiences, it also reminds us that Latinos and others have managed to claim spaces in very interesting and exciting ways over time. They've laid claims to those sites like churches and made them theirs, or schools, or bars, or street corners, or parks. They've articulated a sense of themselves by building their own homes or decorating the homes they moved into. And they've, of course, been vocal residents and proud proponents of their neighborhoods and their towns. But they've also managed to make and to sustain connections to very far away places. They've lived in Tampa with their hearts in Cuba. They've organized clubs in Los Angeles, like this one here, whose entire focus was to send money back home to small hometowns in northern Mexico with which communities remain connected. And like Professor Montejano's family, they have moved as seasonal workers throughout the country, setting down groups of cousins and friends throughout this country and laying claim to those places. They have claimed, in other words, more than one place as their own. And so I would encourage you to think about that dynamic, what Marcus Garvey once discussed as the dynamics, the importance of understanding both roots and digging into the roots in a community, but also the routes that people take, the movement and the insistence on place, on location, on residency, on rootedness. So what might this mean for you as local historians interested in these communities? Simply that you must keep these questions of space and place in mind as you discuss the Latino histories in your communities. Where have people moved to and from? Why have they moved here? What places and spaces here have mattered most to them? How have people imagined the maps of their lives, right? The cultural geographies of their communities and of their families. You're going to get many different answers to these kinds of questions wherever you work. And I want, therefore, to use this chance to highlight quickly a fourth theme in the Latino Americans series that might also guide your work. And that's an interest in the complexity and the internal diversity of Latino communities. Now, complexity, diversity, we really wouldn't want it any other way, right? We know that the people we know personally are endlessly interesting and multi-layered, that our friends and our family are not drawn in black and white, that they are instead three-dimensional, contradictory, complex. And so I'd urge you to keep in mind that good public history approaches sort of like good literature, right? By representing characters in ways that seem real, complex, contradictory, and open-ended. The documentary series, in my view, does a pretty good job of making the complexity of Latino subjects clear in the space of just a few hours. And I think you all can build on that work to do even more, again, keeping time and place in mind, to make sure that you hear Latinos speaking in many discordant voices, right? Many voices, that was theme 1. Multiplicity is the point. Public history can help people better understand that we do not live in a simple world, that we do not live in a world of binaries, right? Of black and white, of Latino and white, of women and men, of gay or straight, of young or old. Things are much more mixed, so much more complicated than that. People, of course, often do live in these categories, and those categories affect our experiences, but they affect our experiences in multiple ways. So I would urge you to think about your projects as working not just to make Latino history more clear and more present, but also, when you can, to use your projects to make Latino history, in a funny way, more confusing, more complicated, more honest to the world that we know. Help the public to resist simple explanations and to see the multiple factors that shaped events in the past. Help them to see that intersecting power relations assured that different groups of people would experience certain events differently, or different periods of history differently than they had ever thought about before. An acceptance of complexity in this way, I think, is a defining feature of the best humanities scholarship, and it characterizes some of what I like best about the Latino Americans series. But I want to close by saying clearly that our work with Latino history is not just about cataloging endless variety and endless multiplicity, showing all the ways in which people in one place or one historical period were different from everybody else, or recording the experiences of one social group that are unlike the experiences of anyone else. Thinking about differences and multiplicity, to me, is fundamental to humanities work, but so is connecting those stories back to other histories and other experiences, especially local experiences. Making connections, then, is my 5th and final theme, connections. And it's one that's inescapably important in working with the public. You want to introduce audiences to new material. Indeed, you want to draw new material out of your audiences to elicit their perspectives and hear those unique voices that I mentioned. But you also want them to connect what they're learning to what they already know or think they know. You want them to connect their experiences with those of some of their neighbors' experiences. You want them to ask questions that emphasize comparisons, that bring up contrasts, that raise analogies or possible parallels to things that they know. So I would urge you in your work to provide the frame and some of the thread, but to let audiences weave their stories with your thread and with others. This can be, I think, a powerful form of learning and a powerful form of community engagement. The Latino American series can help your communities to make connections to different experiences and different perspectives. The films can be a platform to do more, a valuable starting point for those connections. So keep the word connections at the front of your mind and think as you do so about how humanities as a set of interests can help with those sort of connections that you're interested in. If we listen to Latino voices in the past, voices, theme 1, right? If we listen to those voices, if we think about how communities and priorities have changed over time, theme 2, if we are attentive to the places that have mattered to these residents, and if we ask why they've mattered, that's theme 3, places, and if we remain committed to drawing complex portraits of community multiplicity, theme 4, I think we can make those analytical connections between Latino histories and the experiences of others, theme 5. They may be uneasy connections. They may be tenuous connections, connections that burst forward under certain conditions and then flame out, right? Those connections that may no longer be there. Connections that might be friendly, or connections that might be defined by conflict. But they will be, I think, connections that help us think about the humanity of Latinos today and in the past. And I hope in that work that you do that scholars like me in the humanities can be helpful. Thank you.